Right, so once again, hi and welcome all to our second appointment with the online symposium, Histories in and at Play, Debates on Historical Game Studies. Before beginning, I would like to thank a few people, including Valerio Cianfrocca, Francesco Oliva, Lorena Rao, Valerio Tinalli, who are with Roma Tre University and have recently founded the Ludus Committee, which stands for Letture dell'uso digitale nell'universo storico. I'd like to thank the DIGRA Italia board, comprising Paolo Ruffino, myself, Ilaria Mariani, Enrico Gandolfi, Riccardo Fassone, Manuel Maximilian Riolo, and Alan Mattiassi. Hopefully I haven't left out anybody. And of course, I'd like to now very much thank today's speakers for joining us with their research. Just checking that we're actually recording, and it looks like we are. So today we have Stefano Caselli, who is a PhD researcher at the University of Malta, with a talk titled Digital Memory Play Spaces, Memory Making Through Fire Emblem Three Houses. Then we got Robert Houghton, senior lecturer at University of Winchester, UK, with a paper titled Where is Medieval Italy? A Notable Absence in Anglophone Video Games. And next we have Lorena Rao, who is an independent researcher and journalist from Italy, with a talk titled Mafia Series, Evolution, Depiction and Changes of the Italian, oh my God, I'm missing bits of the title. Can you please complete that for me?
Yeah, Italian-American Mob.
Thank you so much, and sorry about that.
Don't worry.
So before beginning, I wondered whether the Ludus group wanted to share their association's introductory video today, like we've done yesterday. In that case, I will, pass the ball to them to share the screen.
Yeah, and good evening to everyone. And I'm Valerio Cianfrocca, member of the Ludus research group. We are very glad to have you here. We hope that the second part of the conference will suit your expectation. Thank you. And I'll begin with the introductory video.
Buongiorno a tutti, siamo Valerio della Storia nel medium culturale dei
I videogiochi
Debates on Historical Game Studies si terrà il 5 e il 6 novembre dalle 17 alle 19, ora italiana, e verterà proprio su questi temi. È possibile una rappresentazione anche educativa e costruttiva della storia nel videogioco? Noi pensiamo di sì, anzi, l'obiettivo finale dei giochi storici, secondo noi, dovrebbe essere quello di sensibilizzare il pubblico sui grandi temi della storia.
A questo convegno parteciperanno professori e studiosi di spessore internazionale, e ciascuno dei quali tratterà un tema specifico sulla rappresentazione della storia nel mondo videoludico.
Vogliamo ringraziare il Master in Comunicazione Storica dell'Università di Roma Tre e DIGRA Italia per averci aiutato nell'organizzazione di questo convegno, senza i quali non si sarebbe tenuto.
Detto ciò, vi salutiamo e vi auguriamo di vedervi numerosi su Histories in Play.
Good morning, everyone. I am Valerio Tinalli.
And I'm Valerio Cianfrocca.
We are two of the four co-founders of Ludus Research Group. We have built this team during last summer alongside Lorena Rao and Francesco Oliva.
The goal of Ludus is to analyze video games as a medium. We want to explore the connections between video games, historical facts, and historiography.
Historians are often thought of as annoying erudites who criticize every cultural production related to their field of research. We want to change this stereotype.
We know as well that every historical narrative has a specific purpose and is based on specific prejudices.
We want to identify the narratives these ideological superstructure produce and we also want to investigate potential patterns behind these topics.
Our goal is to analyze the common notion of past by focusing on a contemporary cultural product, such as video games.
We will examine in depth these topics on November the 5th and November the 6th during the online conference Histories in Play, Debates on Historical Game Studies.
The symposium is organized in partnership with the Master School in Historical Communication of Roma Tre University and DIGRA Italia.
In this conference, we will outline the state of the art of historical game studies. Several international researchers will join us.
Andrew Elliott from Lincoln University, UK, Esther Wright from Cardiff University, and Rob Houghton from Winchester University.
Stefano Caselli from Malta University, Suvik Mukherjee from Kolkata University, and Lorena Rao, who is a member of Ludus and writes about video games and historical game studies.
We're looking forward to see you at the symposium.
Thank you very much, Valeri, both Valerios, for sharing this. And so without much further ado, I would like to please introduce Stefano Caselli for a brief recap of the talk. And may I ask the audience to raise their hands or type in questions for Stefano so that we may begin the debate. To you, Stefano. Thank you.
Hi, thank you for inviting me here, and of course for organizing all this thing. And my presentation, as well as my research more broadly, was intended to deal with the fact that, of course, the way in which we deal with our own past as a society, as collectivities and both groups, more or less large groups of people, was not only to be addressed as an historical process. My intent was exactly to deal how digital games could represent the past or deal with the past through the concept of memory. And on that purpose, I would like to focus on memory studies rather than on history. And then one of the main purposes of my research at this stage of the research is exactly to deal with how memory studies could prove fruitful for historical game studies, which of course is a field that tends to enlarge its object of study with more broader perspectives. For example, taking into account not only how games could represent or simulate historical events or processes, but with a more broad approach to our past, and therefore, for example, some recent approaches deal with the concept of authenticity rather than of accuracy. And so my aim is exactly to deal with how we could represent our past without stepping into the field of history. So how could our collective view of our past, and therefore our collective framework of memory, could lead us to new forms of representation of the past and of reflection upon the past. And therefore, how could our identity and the formation of our current identity as social groups or individuals could be framed towards this broader understanding of our past. I chose Fire Emblem Three Houses as an example, not because it is the most memory-making game of all of us, but because as an example, as a case studies, I thought that it would be great because it encapsulates a lot of different memory makings and a lot of different processes of iconization, which I think that is a process that lies at the basis of how we could understand our past without stepping into history, or rather in enlarging our understanding of history and of our past as it's transposed onto our present, or vice versa. Of course, I'm trying to synthesize everything. I hope it has been clear.
Thank you very much, Stefan, for sharing this summary of your research. So I don't see any raised hands. I'm not sure it's my problem here not seeing that. And I don't see any questions yet. So I'd like to break the ice myself. And you know, first of all, thanks a lot. I really appreciated the way that your talk discussed notions such as selective authenticity, the topoi and cliches that come with representational conventions, and the Baudrillardian, if that adjective exists, analysis that you provided. So particularly the notion of mnemonic iconization. I think that it's really important for us to deconstruct the historical or also para-historical notions of authenticity that surround texts. There's a question I've got for you, and it's about the definition that you provide of historical games. You say that there is no ontological definition of that. And I wondered what you meant with that terminology within your disciplinary fields in regards to your method, because I tend to be skeptical of any idealistic or non-constructivist view of categories. For instance, you say that Assassin's Creed is a system for historicizing, that we can look at that for that reason, but I would probably, from my perspective, I would rather say that it's a commercial product that sells an ambience of historiographical representation. So I wondered whether there was an intentional choice of words, of terminology on your behalf, for instance, coming from semiotics or another methods, and if you could elaborate on that, because I think it was interesting. Thank you.
Thank you for your question. With ontological definition of historical games, the term ontological, and that's the core part of your question, I think. I did not mean to step into the field of ontology, of course. What I meant was only that in stepping into the field of historical game studies, I was trying to understand how a game could be defined as historical. Of course, for example, Chapman or other scholars within the field focus on the fact that historical games as a term is not based on ludological aspects of the games, but rather on the themes of the games. So as a consequence, I think that one of the first purposes of my research was to understand if there is such a thing as an historical game. I mean, if historical games could be understood as historical from a thematic perspective, a narratological perspective. Forgive me the simplistic view on both ludological and narratological perspectives. I was interested in understand if I could make a difference, if I could distinguish between an historical game and an unhistorical or unhistorical fiction game. And that was exactly what recent historical game studies are concerned with, as far as I can see, at least. And for example, one of the most useful concepts I dealt with was that of Chapman as system for historing, because that helped me to define historical games not by an ontological game, again in inverted commas, a lot of inverted commas way, but rather, of course, if we conceive historical games as systems for historing, then basically not every kind of game, but a lot of different kinds of games from both the ludological and narratological perspectives could serve as a system for historing. From what concerns your question, for example, Assassin's Creed is of course an historical fiction with science fiction elements, with a lot of inaccuracies and with a lot of problematic aspects for what concerns the representation of histories and also the simulation of historical processes. But in a way, historical game studies deal with the historicity of Assassin's Creed. And this because the way in which it represents architectures, context of living and societies is nonetheless historical. So what is of interest for me in this definition of historical games as not something objectively historical, but rather something we can historize upon, and again, forgive me the phrasing, was exactly this. If we could perceive Assassin's Creed, which is an historical fiction with the science fiction elements, as an historical game, nonetheless, similarly, where is the limit? What are the boundaries of historical games, or of games which we can use as systems for historian? And was exactly by looking for the answer to this question that I began inquiring the ways in which even totally unhistorical games such as Spore, which I mentioned in the presentation, or Fire Emblem Three Houses, which are both totally unhistorical games, could nonetheless provide some knowledge about our past. And what kind of knowledge is this, and how could we define this knowledge? Of course, the field of history revealed itself a little inadequate to define the sort of knowledge that results from this approach to the past. And that's why I stepped into the field of memory studies. I hope I've answered your question, of course.
Thank you very much, Stefano. And I think you did. And I like you mentioned the fact that even games that are not presented as having an historical content in strictly specific terms, they become gateways for ideas about the past, which I think is something we have discussed during the first day. So I wonder whether games can be a medium not just for the dissemination of history, but also a sort of gateway drug to historiographical practice in a way. So I think we have a question from Nick Webber. So if they could step in.
Yeah, thank you. And thanks, Stefano. I really enjoy work about memory. I find it really interesting from a historical perspective as someone who's very interested in historiography. I've got a question for you about ideas of mediation. I'm conscious that some writing on historiography talks about memory studies as being prompted by kind of postmodern thinking around historiography, a reaction to ideas that there's no such thing, or that we can't really access a past, there's no past for us to reach for. And you talk about yourself, the kind of the lack of an ultimate truth about a past. So if the past's not there for us to access, what is being mediated in these processes? I'm kind of curious to hear really how you're understanding mediation working here.
Okay, thank you for your question. This question is really heavily based upon memory studies rather than on historical game studies. But I think that's really important to answer that, because of course, at the basis of how we could relate to games that in a way deals in this specific way to the past, to understand this is really pivotal to address how collective memory is perceived and discussed within memory studies. The idea of mediation is pivotal in memory studies because, of course, in collective memory studies especially, and cultural memory studies, as a consequence, we cannot speak about memory if not by stepping into the inherent mediality and mediation of memory. So every memory is in a way mediated only, even only if, because it is a memory we can think about, we can discuss. So even the only memory which is not mediated in a sense is the memory which is private. So in the moment in which I share this memory becomes inevitably mediated. And especially all the memories we can think of as a society, as groups, are mediated more and more, for example, by books, by monuments, and so on and so forth, by all the processes that are around the way in which our past is negotiated again and again within our society or through our society. For what concerns the existence of a truth about the past, of course, the question is, I tend to be Baudrillardian, to use again the Marco Benoit Carbone's expression, but not too much. I mean, the fact is that, of course, something exists in the past, otherwise we are only navigating through the void or something, but that could not be addressed by memory studies, because memory studies is focused on the performance of memory. I mean, the difference between memory and history bases exactly upon the fact that memory is a present process, and that we are in a way taking the past into our present by superimposing the present onto that past. So, I mean, the truth is the objective of history in a way. I mean, the historian is aimed in a way to recover this truth of the past by evidences, by, in a way, re-elaborating and narrating this past in a way. But on the other hand, if we focus on memory, we are speaking strictly about the present. So how the past is recovered and used to build a cohesive and a consistent view of our identity as groups, as individuals, and how we could make the past productive by reimagining it for our present. So memory is, it is not an alternative to history. I mean, memory studies are not interested in saying something like historians are interested in something that doesn't exist. This is not the purpose of memory studies, but rather memory studies is focused on present ways of remembering the past rather than on what actually happened back then. For example, in Fire Emblem Three Houses, it is impossible to think about how that armor or that weapon deal with an actual representation of an actual past. I mean, there the actual past is totally vanished. And if we think about the representations in memory in Fire Emblem Three Houses, we are thinking about representations that are filtered again and again and mediated again and again, and that are available to us only as something reimagined rather than recovered and analyzed from the past itself. So by saying that the actual past doesn't exist, I'm not trying to say as a truth, but rather to claim that that's not the object of study of memory studies and of this perspective as well. So by speaking of memory studies, I'm interested in how we can think about the past in a way that's useful to how we in the present represent ourselves and construct or design our identity as social groups or as individuals. Of course, the past existed back then. Yeah, that would be crazy to admit the contrary. So,
thank you.
You're welcome.
Thank you, Stefano. So we got 3 more questions, and I think that we should stick to these 3, and then maybe we can get a few more if we got time. But I doubt that we'll be able to do more than 3. But we got first from Jaime Alonge, then from Lorena Rao, and then from Valerio Tinalli. Thank you.
Hi. I'm not a postmodernist. I do believe that there is such a thing as truth. I think that you can count the votes and you can demonstrate that Joe Biden won the elections in the United States. But at the same time, I totally agree with Stefano Caselli approach. The main point with popular media is not truth, is more representation, is adaptation. And I think that your idea of switching from history to memory is very productive, because this way you totally skip the question of fidelity with, for at least for me, it is quite pointless. I mean, you can, of course, verify if a game uses the correct weapon, the correct suit or whatever, but I don't think that it is the more interesting question to ask, no, such a work. And then I would like to ask you if in your research, in the end, the idea of memory takes you to work on adaptation as a broader concept. I mean, a game designer can use memory, can use real facts reimagined through our mind, as he, she can use a novel something totally fictional, but that can be a useful tool, just as some memory from a real past.
Thank you very much for your question, and that's actually the point of my research. On one hand, this already exists. I mean, even if an author is totally or a designer in that case, is totally disinterested in using memory as a conceptual or theoretical tool to grasp something from the past or from the culture he or she is producing within, he or she already takes into account memory, even unintentionally. I mean, what I was trying to make clear by analyzing Fire Emblem Three Houses is that even if you are totally uninterested in representing medieval history or something truth about the medieval history of Western society or Eastern societies, nonetheless, you are using memory, because everything you do as an author, as a designer, is inscribed within a broader framework of memory. So even if you are trying to make the perfect, the most accurate or representation of something past, nonetheless, the fact that you are not in a vacuum. I mean, you as a designer are always within some sort of context of cultural context in the broadest sense possible. In a way, you are influenced by the memory framework you are operating within. In a way, every kind of expression is a sort of memory performance, in the sense that if I tell something, if I recount something, for example, the way in which I am recounting the specific fact is influenced and is shaped towards a broader memory framework. In memory studies, they insist a lot on the concept of framework of memory, because being me as a designer, for example, a Western designer and a designer of 27 years of age, and something, a scholar within game studies and memory studies and so on and so forth, I cannot but recount something by being inscribed towards a broader memory perspective, a broader context or framework of memory that in a way influence what I am recounting, what I am telling, what I'm representing or trying to simulate. So every kind of text, every kind of proposition, every kind of narrativization is in a way a memory performance of its own author or its own designer in the case. This from a perspective. From the other perspective, one of the main purposes of my research at this stage, at least, is to find how the memory framework applied to historical games and to how we represent or simulate or more broadly deal with our past could prove fruitful for educational perspectives or for the designer perspective. So on one hand, I could answer your question by saying simply, this already exists. I mean, it's inevitable. Even historians, in a way, perform memory while they're historing. And that's the main point of collective memory studies in a certain way. And on the other hand, the way in which memory and the memory framework and the memory perspective could prove useful to theorize how we deal with our past through games or more broadly through our media is exactly one of the main purposes of my research at this moment. I am looking for how memory could prove useful for enriching our dealing with educational games, for example, with the education through games or the education upon games. I'm also interested in memory about games. So, for example, the canon, the idea of canon, the idea of history of games, or how personal memories of games relate to a wider memory framework of our own life or our life as groups or collectivities. So I'm interested in that. I could also raise to you and revolt to you the question, because I'm especially interested in how memory could prove fruitful as a concept and as a perspective for educational purposes, for the purpose of how, as broadly as possible, again, we deal with our past through games. Could the memories perspective become useful for a designer, for example? I think it could, but now I am exactly dealing with this issue with my research, and to find a social productivity of all these academic struggle through memory or history or historical games or the past, and how it's depicted through our games. I hope I've answered your question. And
thank you, Stefano. So we got two more questions, one from Lorena and the other one from Valerio Tinalli. May I ask, please, to hear both questions, and then if you could kindly answer both, Stefano, I think that will help us not to run over. Thank you.
okay, fine.
Actually, it's not a question, it's more an observation, because I think that no-historical video games can be useful to understand the spread of collective imagery. In the case of Free Emblem, can you remember the name of the game, please?
Fire Emblem Three Houses.
Right, sorry. It's a Japanese production inspired by Western fantasy, but also in the actual video games generation, in the nowadays video games. For example, Death Stranding. It's a futuristic game, but it's also a Western metaphor, because we can find the journey from the east to the west to unify United States. We have the individualism, the wilderness. So I don't know if you agree with me, and understand that collective imagery can be one of the goals of memory study or no historical video game studies.
Can we hear from Valerio as well, please?
Mm-hmm.
Yes, is I think a short question. And are video games a sociological or anthropological tool to deal with some deniers, like the negation of some phenomenon of the past, who often spend so much time to build a common memory?
Thank you both for your questions. For what concerns the question of Lorena, yes, that's exactly the point. I mean, one of the main concerns of recent memory studies is exactly the concept of transnational memory or multidirectional memory, which addresses exactly the fact that, of course, a Japanese game can, for example, deal with a metaphor of Western culture or a memory of the Western civilization, as to say. So in a way, yes, I think that it's all about the imaginary, and the imaginary is a sort of baggage that we can analyze and we can deal with only, or rather especially through by using the tools that memory studies provide us. I mean, the fact that Death Stranding, for example, as you mentioned, is a Japanese game made by a Japanese author. Okay, forgive me for the simplistic view on gaming authorship, but the fact that it's a Japanese game focused on, in a way, on Western society is exactly the point with memory studies. I mean, we can deal with transnational or multidirectional ways in which memory constructs an identity which is no more related to singular nations or to specific nation, but is a broader and a multifaceted way to view memory, and how memory produce imaginaries, make imaginaries influence one with the other, and so on and so forth. So I hope this answers your question, because yes, the imaginary is certainly a pivotal matter in hand here.
Okay, thank you.
And for what concerns Valerio, can I ask you to repeat your question? Because while I was answering to the previous one, I totally forgot yours, and sorry.
Of course, don't worry. And the short question is that our video games could be used as a sociological or anthropological tool to understand or to deal with some deniers who often spend so much time to build a common memory to justify their points.
I mean, thank you for your question. It's a really interesting question, and to be honest, it would require a lot of time to answer that, because that's exactly the reason why recently we are speaking about hegemonical perspectives on games, and of course cultural biases expressed through games or imposed unintentionally again on games. So in a way, the question is about the fact that we as societies and individual players may need some kind of gaming literacy for what concerns, of course, even the representational aspects of games and the memory aspects of games. So from a memory perspective, we could, and one of the aim of my research as well, maybe I will cut off this part at the end, so I cannot make promises about that, but one of the main concerns from the memory perspective upon games is that we may need some way to address how gaming literacy could move along the line of how we deal with our past through games. Once we get some sort of gaming literacy that addresses the intrinsic and inherent complexity of games and the way in which also games as other media forms can be mirror of their ages, mirror of the societies that produce them, only once we develop our gaming literacy along this line, maybe we can deal with games that in a way reproduce or superimpose hegemonic perspectives on the past. And that's also a main issue for historiography as well. Historiography deal with how can we speak about history, even if history is only written by who won the certain war, for example. And that's a question even for the memory perspective. And the memory perspective, in a way, already deals with the fact that being our vision of the past, our representation of a certain past, being influenced by how we are developing our actual identity, our present identity. In a way, this already addresses the fact that that past could be only operational in a way, so functional to our present view of ourselves as a society. I think that to address how, for example, even Fire Emblem Three Houses is and cannot but be in a way hegemonic or reproduce an hegemonic view on the past. And these, I suggest you to read, for example, the work of Hammar, of Mukherjee, who presented yesterday here. These are all about how games inevitably and cannot but reproduce our view of a certain view of the world, and we have, as a society, as individual players, to deal with how they can represent and reproduce and in a certain way remember their own past in a specific way. I think that's all about gaming literacy, because we are almost every player is tempted to play a game as a simple game. I mean, it's just a game. It isn't saying something about a precise view of the world. Only with gaming literacy we can approach even gameplay mechanics which appear to be neutral as not neutral at all. And that's the point of taking a memory perspective on games as well. I hope I answered your question.
Yes, of course. Thank you. Very interesting topic.
Thanks.
Thank you very much, Stefano, for your talk, for sharing your thoughts and engaging with your respondents. So we're sharp on schedule. So we're going to have a 5 minutes break, during which I will stop recording, and I look forward to seeing you in 5 minutes for the next talk. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much.
So hi, and welcome back to Histories in and at Play. This is the second part of session 2, and I would like to welcome our next speaker for a brief 2-minute recap of the talk. So may I introduce Robert Houghton, who is Senior Lecturer at the University of Winchester.
Thank you, Marco, and in fact, yeah, thank you all to all the organisers for having me, and for everyone for showing up, watching my video, and so forth. Basically, what I was talking about in my presentation, it's something about, it's a bit of an application. It's a bit of using a lot of what Stefano's been talking about here. So when we're looking at the representations of the Middle Ages, or indeed any other historical period in computer games, or any other games for that matter, this is inevitably through the lens of popular culture. This is inevitably being impacted by the tropes associated with the Middle Ages, with the medieval period. What I'd add to that, though, is it's not just the case of these popular tropes being imposed on computer games, because games have developed their own series of tropes. And a lot of my research at the moment is looking at how these gaming tropes interact with these popular conceptions of the Middle Ages. And a lot of the time they serve to exaggerate each other. So we see a ridiculously white Middle Ages is presented within a lot of games. At the same time, we see a ridiculously violent Middle Ages. But in a lot of other ways, we get some rather unexpected outcomes here. So as I've explained as I've suggested in my talk, we very rarely see medieval Italy presented to any great depth within any historical games. And I think this is primarily a consequence of the fact that the popular image of Italy does not fit with either the popular image of the Middle Ages or with many gaming tropes. And I think there's some parallels here with a lot of what Trubik was saying yesterday, and a lot of Trubik's work more generally. Wherein this group, this group which doesn't fit with modern perceptions of a period or an area, is erased, it's marginalized, or it's abstracted. I'm not saying this is the same as what we see with a lot of these games about colonialism, a lot of this removal of non-white faces from across the world, from across games in general. But there are certain parallels, and I think this is why Italy doesn't appear so frequently. I'd be very keen to hear anyone who has counterexamples for this. But yeah, that's basically it. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Robert. And I think we do have questions here. So first of all, we got a question from Helium Viana Teles. I'm not sure that's a question for you or a more general question. So I just wanted to briefly ask,
So he's actually Helium, and he's asking about what the definition of historical games is. I'm just going to go with the broadest possible definition. Any game, or anything that could even be vaguely defined as a game, which deals with a historical period or with historical themes. So typically when I'm talking about medieval games, I think like Stefano, I'm including games that have fantasy elements, games that are wholly fictional. I think they can tell us a lot of interesting things about history, even if they're not set within the real world.
Thank you, Rob. And so we got lots of questions for you.
Oh, wow.
Let's start with Valerio, and then we will take William Hepburn. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. My question is the fact that video games sales in Italy are not so high as other countries correlated to the poor representation of Italy in medieval games?
I think, yeah, I think that's very likely to be the case. I think it's a bit of a vicious circle, I suppose is the term. So we have very few games which really address Italy to any great extent. So obviously there are plenty of games which address Rome. I know Layla's produced a game which I'm very anxious to get hold of and play imminently. And Rome obviously appears. We'll very often see Italy presented in games dealing with the 20th century. Quite often Italy will appear in a Renaissance setting, but within the Middle Ages, Italy is just not there at all. I'm not sure to what extent this is down to, well, there's not an interest in these games because they don't exist, or these games aren't being produced because it's perceived that there's not this interest in them. And I suspect there's a lot of potential to sell games about medieval Italy, both within Italy itself and within, well, the wider world. It's a market that's not really been tapped.
Thank you, Rob. So the next question comes from Willem Hepburn, and they say, thanks for a really interesting paper. How would you compare the representation of medieval Italy in games with that of medieval Germany?
Yeah, right. Oh, yeah, okay, it's time for very broad sweeping generalizations. I think Germany typically comes across more frequently and the representations of Germany typically look closer to the reality. And I appreciate by saying that I'm inviting a swarm of German historians and German game studies scholars to descend on me. But I think this is very much the case. We have this expectation within the Anglophone world. We have this particular vision of the Middle Ages. And as I've said, it's a rural world. It's ruled over by kings and so forth. And Italy really doesn't fit that expectation. Germany doesn't quite fit that expectation either, because clearly Germany is not England, it's not Scandinavia. But at the same time, it's much more recognizable than Italy is, than Spain is for that, or Iberia is for that matter. And I think even games set in Eastern Europe, I think they're more recognizably medieval than anything we'd find set in Italy. So games like The Witcher, games like Kingdom Come Deliverance, so these games which lean on Polish or Czech history or folklore, they're still recognizably medieval in a way that Italy generally isn't. Does that cover it, William?
So we don't have feedback from Willem, unfortunately, but thank you very much. I think it really did cover that. So next we have Vinicius. Sorry if I'm mispronouncing that.
No, that's quite all right, Marco. Hello, Robert. My question goes in line with what William asked. When I saw your paper, I wonder if you're not pushing the argument of Italian exceptionalism a little bit too far, because there are a lot of those characteristics which you mentioned are particular to medieval Italy, like political fragmentation and diversity and complexity, that I think can find parallels in the image of other spaces in the medieval world, such as the Iberian Peninsula or the eastern edge of Europe with Central Asia or the Baltic. So how do you compare in general these representations of non-Anglophone spaces?
Yeah, no, you're absolutely right, British. So yeah, I should say I'm intending Italy as an example, not the only case here. Various reasons why I chose to speak about Italy. Firstly, it's the area which I study, it's the area I'm most familiar with, and it seemed appropriate given the organisers of the conference. Certainly, I think a lot of the ideas I talk about can be applied across Europe and further afield. So certainly Iberia's very often excluded from these games. I think for many of the same, or for similar reasons in many ways. Iberia is a bit different, but I think perhaps more fundamentally, it's less clearly a white area. It's tying in to a lot of what Struvik's been saying about the focus on the colonial masters, as it were. And I think you're absolutely right. It's anything that doesn't look like it belongs in the period, whether that's in Italy or Iberia or Eastern Europe, it's very often ignored. I mean, there's a few exceptions to the Crusades. The Crusades get a lot of airtime. Any game about the Middle Ages will almost invariably mention the Crusades, even if it doesn't really fit in the timescale of the game. And also the Byzantines. Everybody wants to go to Constantinople for some reason. But no, I think you're absolutely right. And as I think I mentioned briefly in the presentation, but I should probably have elaborated. If we move beyond the Anglo-Saxon, Anglo-Norman world and the Viking world, there's much less coverage of the Middle Ages in general. Does that sound about correct to you?
Yes, it does. Thank you.
Brilliant. Thank you.
Thank you. So we got 4 more questions, and the next one is from Stefano Caselli.
Yeah, I'll try to be brief. Thank you very much for your presentation. It was really interesting. From my perspective, I found everything about your presentation revolving around the concept of memory brand. I don't know if you're familiar with the concept of memory brand, but it's a concept that authors, scholars such as Ballinger and Salvati define as the brand of, they speak about, if I'm not mistaken, about the World War II brand, World War II, which is a brand that's in a way something that reminds you of that certain historical period, even without dealing with specifically with all those things. And that's, for example, what make you think about science fiction, for example, that it resembles of the World War II, because it deals with all those elements, theoretical elements or concepts that are part of this brand of World War II. Do you think that something like the medieval brand exists? Because that's exactly what I was dealing with my presentation as well. I was trying to look for something that could define the Middle Ages, even without being located or framed towards the Middle Ages.
Yes, no, absolutely. And I think Stefano, you articulated a lot of what I was trying to talk about in my presentation, and you articulated it much better and with much more evidence than I did. So I'm very pleased your presentation was immediately before mine. And yeah, I think it's complicated, but yeah, broadly I agree with you. There is this image of a medieval brand, effectively. And while that's different depending on who you're speaking to, depending on where you're looking at, certainly within games, so these games, as Lorena says, they're very dominated by American perspectives, and the American perspective of the Middle Ages is this very white, this very Northern European image, and I think that's exactly what's going on here. And thank you for reminding me that was maybe a memory brand was a thing. It's been a while since I've read up on this, but no, thank you.
Thank you. Our next question comes from Valerio Cianfrocca.
Yeah, and good evening to Robert Houghton, of course. And I found the speech very, very interesting, also because I'm a Middle Ages historian as well as Valerio Tinalli. And I was wondering, actually, you mentioned several times the Italian communes, of course, the Italian city-states. And I was wondering if in Middle Ages video games, it's kind of hard to make an understanding of the overlapping of political layers, such as the Holy Roman Empire and the city-states, and also, of course, the Pope and so on. So this kind of, I don't know, this kind of issues, this difficulty to make actually a good representation of this complexity, should it be one of the causes of this lack of representation of Italian Middle Ages history?
Yeah, I think this is absolutely a contributing factor, Valeria. Thank you for your question. It's basically, yeah, I think so. We've seen various attempts to represent the Italian cities within strategy games. So famously Venice within not Crusader Kings, within Civilization V, where it's basically the one city challenge, which is it's an incredibly interesting playthrough. I really enjoyed that approach. But ultimately Venice is still fundamentally the same as any other civilization. You always have the same goal, and if you're as poor a player as me, you almost inevitably end up trying to conquer the world and failing horribly. But the example I used in the presentation was from Crusader Kings 2, and so this is a game that's infamous for its depth, for its complexity, and well, yeah, but there's an attempt to represent the Italian city-states, or at least represent the Italian maritime republics within the game. So you can play as Venice, Genoa, Pisa, and so forth. I don't think it's any coincidence that this is one of the least well-selling expansions for the game that they put out. It's been the mechanic. So I don't think this reflects at all on the interest in the period, but it's an expansion that was broadly slated because, well, the mechanics just didn't work quite as well as they should do. They've taken these mechanics that have been built specifically with the feudal system in mind, and they try to adapt this for the communes. And there's a lot of really interesting things going on there, but the game engine simply hasn't been built to deal with them. And I think it's almost the point where, well, if you want to represent the Italian cities, you need to make the game about the Italian cities and build it from the ground up. So we're looking at a much smaller geographical area, probably just looking at northern and central Italy, realistically. And then have the Germans, the French, and so forth, just as these outside influences coming in, the barbarians almost. So yeah, I think you're absolutely right. I think it's a difficulty in representing the Italian cities within mainly strategy games, but in other games as well, other genres as well. This is definitely a reason why Italy's not around so much. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you so much.
So our next question comes from Mateus Carvalho. I hope I've pronounced that. I don't know whether they want to say the question or
Sorry, I'm not sorry. Yeah, so Mateus is asking about Crusader Kings. Yeah, I realise I've just preempted this a little bit more, but yeah, I think I have a lot of love for Crusader Kings, and I think a lot of the, yeah, like as I've said, it's a game that has a huge amount of depth about, well, a lot of aspects of medieval society, medieval politics, and so forth. And as I've said, I think even then it struggles to represent the cities of northern Italy, the city communes in general, because it's simply not been built with that in mind. I think another point I'd like to, I suppose, add to that, one of my other niggles with Crusader Kings 2 is while you're able to do a huge amount of things, and while there's a huge amount of programming gone into allowing you to play the game, so you're not an all-conquering king. If you want to, you can focus on building up your dynasty, you can focus on court intrigue, you can focus on economy. While all of that's within the game, most of it gets ignored by the majority of players who just fall back on conquering the world. And we can see this on the forums, is that basically post-your empire threads, and people they've done ridiculous things. They've conquered Europe as the Count of Dublin, for example, this kind of thing. So yeah, I hope that covers it, Matthias. Was that sufficient? Sorry. Cheers.
Thank you. So the next question is from Eleni Psaros, and they write, do you find that there is specific representation of whites alongside a lack of other ethnicities? For instance, the absence of fairer white people, or a stereotype of what a Mediterranean person should look like?
Okay, so within within representations of Italians within games, I think I'm following that correctly. This is something I've not looked into to a great extent, but I would not be remotely surprised if, when we do see Italians, we see a lot of stereotypes being deployed on this. So I think, yeah, stereotypical looks, stereotypical behaviour, and so forth. I'm trying to remember the game. I feel it was one of the Witcher series where you have a city that's obviously drawing on an Italian city, and most of your dealings within the game, within this city, are all about a crime family. And there's very, very clear undertones of mafia coming on here with all the baggage that carries with it. So I think, yeah, absolutely, there's a lot of stereotyping in place here, and I suspect this is true of, well, Shuba will know much better than me, but this is going to be true of every group represented within games that aren't North European white.
Thank you. And if I can chip in on that, I just want to remind that of course, Italianness, something quite complex, and that's often straddles the line between whiteness and otherness based on the context. And if you think of Super Mario, that's a Mediterranean stereotype, but that's quite a long story, and I don't want to steal anyway. We got another observation from Willem Hepburn. I don't know whether they want to share that.
Hi, yeah, sorry, no, it was just, it wasn't really a question, just to quickly note, it just brought to mind your paper, The Witcher 3, and I think you highlighted that it's kind of Eastern European influence in the main game, but then I've not actually played all of the expansion, just a little bit, but it's kind of got this sort of overblown depiction of a kind of classic chivalric sort of Western European Middle Ages, and I just wondered if you had any thoughts about that. It's almost to an extent it's kind of parodying it, because that doesn't really fit with the kind of gritty take of The Witcher's kind of main story. But yeah, it was just an observation really rather than a question, but yeah.
No, it's a really interesting observation, and I think, yeah, I think there's a lot to be said from taking these non-Western European, Northwestern European perspectives and using them as the basis to create perspectives of the West. And I know this is something we see a lot with Japanese games. And yeah, I think there's a lot of very interesting work to be done there, and I'm not remotely qualified to comment on it, I'm afraid.
Thank you. So we got a question from Paolo, and I think we can take actually another question if other people from the audience want to think about it. But I will leave it to Paolo for the next one.
Yes, do you want me to ask the question? Yeah, yeah, Rob, thank you for your presentation, and thank you for letting. I learned about Pope Simulator through your talk, and I'll be eternally grateful. So I was wondering to what extent we are perhaps the bigger issue here is let's say a dependence of the medium of the video game on representations in other media, popular culture, cinema, and so on. So aren't we perhaps looking at a problem that is more about the general lack of representations of medieval Italy on a much broader range of media, and the reliance of video games on pre-existing tropes and themes that can be that are kind of widely accessible by a mainstream audience?
Yeah, no, I think this is absolutely the case. So yeah, absolutely. The fact that we barely see Italy, medieval Italy, certainly in any films, TV series, and so forth. Well, in the Anglophone works like that. I suppose the big exception that's immediately sprung to mind now that you mentioned Pope Simulator is, of course, the Borgias. But again, that's leaning very heavily on stereotypes, very heavily on this image of what the medieval world was like within the popular imagination. And I suppose that's really stretching the boundaries of medieval as well. But what I'd say to that, yeah, this is absolutely the case. But I think the fact that we're dealing with games here makes it a little bit more complicated, because we see there's plenty of other areas of Europe which we don't see represented within TV, film, and so forth. So, well, until very recently, Poland, but I appreciate the Witcher series has rather turned that on its head. Places like Czechia, Czech Republic, and further east, and there's still the potential. Well, there's still games which deal with these areas to a substantial extent, or are based within these areas, and it's something I don't think we see as much of in Italy, or at least we don't see as much as we might expect to within Italy. And absolutely, that's in large part down to the fact that we don't see it with medieval Italy in any form of media. But I think the fact that, I think that when we're dealing with games, it possibly exacerbates the situation. It certainly changes it. So as I mentioned towards the end of the presentation, we do see medieval Italy being used in specific types of game. And this plays in, of course, it plays into the stereotypes. So Italians are traders, Italians are urban dwellers. Italians are free-running assassins. But I think there's something, your point is absolutely valid, but I think there's something a little bit more complicated going on because of the collision with these popular ideas and the formats of the media. Does that sound reasonable? Thank you.
Thank you very much, Rob. So I've actually got a question, Maite, for you. Following on Paolo's question, the fact that, you know, we're used to seeing Italy through a limited, you know, certain kinds of lenses and perspectives that we know quite well. So we got these, I think that Michael Hertzfeld, I'm not sure I'm attributing that right, but what he defined unescapable histories, these grand narratives that surround Italy. And my question for you is about the role of the academic and historian, whether it's through games, well, specifically, of course, about through games, but also more in general. What do you think in our day and age, perhaps in the United Kingdom, is or should be the role of the academic and the historian and the game scholar when it comes to maybe allowing for public and popular histories that would reject these sorts of dominant narratives that we have? What do you think? I understand it's quite hard to point to a solution or whether or not this would be a problem and in what sense, but.
No, I think this is, yeah. I mean, obviously this is a hugely topical issue. It's, well, whether or not Biden's managed to take the presidential election or not is the issue of medievalism within politics is vast. Within media is hugely important as well. It's not going to be the only. Yeah, it's not going to be the only part of the solution, but I think a big element here is supporting indie games. Indie games will save the world. We have a lot of these big studios, so yeah, we have a lot of the big studios working with huge budgets creating games. They can't afford to take risks, or at least this is the rhetoric they'll pull out. They can't afford to take risks, so they're always going to appeal to their known audience. They're always going to have the white male playable character. Basically, they're going to have a character who looks suspiciously like me. And it's demonstrable that there is a market for games based around other figures. It's demonstrable there's a market for these different representations of the Middle Ages or any other period of history. So I think basically as historians, the best we can do is, the best thing we can do is to help game designers and perhaps try and move away from getting tied up with the bigger game studios and look more towards the indie games, look more towards these smaller studios who haven't got the same financial pressures or are a bit more heroic about the risks they're willing to take that make more interesting games. Might not necessarily be so thoroughly polished, although I've seen some incredible indie games recently. But the very fact that they're making history, they're carrying out their historying, to use Stefano's phrasing, and they're doing so in a way that's going to have a huge impact on their audience. And if there's anything we can do to help, we really ought to be doing it.
Thank you very much. I think that really answers that. I think you point to a couple of very interesting directions which seem to be recurring throughout the workshop, and something that we've discussed yesterday is when it comes to bringing production together with academia. I know some people from the audience are nodding because that was also the point that they brought forward. And I think that the other point is quite interesting where you mentioned indie production, so independent productions which are supposed to be able to break from the mold of AAA games and the sorts of dominant expectations about representation, which then become this sorts of self-fulfilling prophecy, and they keep being reiterated all the time. I wondered whether anyone wanted to follow on these themes before a break, which is, however, looming over us quite quickly anyway. Or maybe what do you think about that, Rob?
Well, no, I suppose I appreciate. I used indie a little bit carelessly there. So it's not always about the budget. It's not always about the size of the studio, how well established they are. But certainly, there's a tendency towards the newer studios, the smaller studios, are better able to do this. I suppose you're absolutely right. There's a tendency once the game has been created just to fall back into these same old patterns. And I suppose the other thing, as historians, as educators, the other thing to be doing is to be teaching the games, to teaching about the sort of history that they represent. It's understanding how games represent history, and there's been a number of excellent papers about this already in the last couple of days, both here and over at the Interactive Past conference. And ultimately, just playing some games. Just get out there, play, see what these games are representing, how they're, and what our students are bringing to the classroom with them. Because these games have a huge influence, or they can have a huge influence on their players. And I suspect with a lot of medieval, well, I know with a lot of medieval history students, a lot of ancient history students, the main impact on their learning before they get to university, the main impact on their learning about these periods will be computer games. So Assassin's Creed will get them into study of the Crusades, but then they'll pick up a load of details by playing Civilization or Total War or what have you. And we just need to be aware of what they're playing and how that's influencing students' perspectives. And once again, get involved with designers as and where it's appropriate.
Thank you, Rob, for summarising these really important bits for discussion. So I would like to thank very much Rob Houghton for his talk and everybody who has engaged in the discussion. I will now be pausing the recording, and I look forward to seeing you in 5 minutes after a new break. Thank you. So hi, and welcome back for the final part of today's session from the conference Histories in and At Play. Before turning to the last speaker, we actually have an extra piece of commentary on Rob Houghton's talk coming from Leila Johnson. So I will leave the mic to her.
Thank you very much. As a side note, you know, I'm a CEO. We work with we have a small studio, 9 people, indie studio. It's very true that we are restrained by, the monies, right? We have to engage a certain amount of money to research the game. So definitely, I second what Paolo said about how much money it takes to actually research a game and do it well. Having said that, we got extremely lucky as a studio to get a deal from our distributor that allows us to spend money researching our game. However, do we take liberties that are not taken by a mainstream game? I feel that we are, as a studio, it is dependent on the studio culture and the studio philosophy. As a studio, we love representing minorities. We like to take those chances. We are comfortable taking those chances. We are backed up by the fact that, for example, lead designer and co-founder has not yet created a game that failed. We take that for granted a little bit, and we try to marry that to the passion that drives us and the message we are trying to deliver. Video games have messages. Video games have an ideology. So I feel that, yes, we are restricted by budget, but also it is highly dependent on the studio culture and the studio philosophy. And there are many studios out there that prove the opposite. They go very white, very male, and they have all the money to go the other way around. But it's really a choice. I hope that clarifies something.
Thank you very much, Leila. I'm not sure Rob Houghton wants to briefly say anything about this.
It's basically just to absolutely agree with what Leila's saying. And if you've not done so already, Leila had an awesome keynote over at the Interactive Past conference earlier today. I know that's going to be the recording's going to be getting posted. And if you're even remotely interested as a historian or game scholar in getting involved with creating historical games, then definitely take a look at that. And yeah, it's all brilliant stuff.
Thanks so much, Rob. So for those who will be watching this as a recording, parts of this conversation about independent productions and the and the issues that we've discussed has taken place in the chat. So we look forward to making the text chat available as well. So let's move forwards now towards the final bit for today. For the conference, which actually concludes the conference. So it's the turn of Lorena Rao, for her 2-minute recap of the talk. Lorena Rao is an independent researcher and journalist from Italy, and she's part of the Ludus research committee. So I would like to introduce her, and please, Lorena, I will pass the mic to you.
Thank you, Marco. I want to thank you again, all the speakers in the audience. So my presentation is about the video game series Mafia to understand the evolution of the depiction of Italian-American mob. This is because usually when we talk about historical game studies, we're talking about strategic games or action adventure like Assassin's Creed or first-person shooter. Game related to a global event like Middle Age or World War II. But what happens with specific issues like Italian-American mob? And the most famous video game series about this topic is Mafia, beside the Grand Theft Auto, that is in general about the organized crime in the United States. So Mafia trilogy starts from the classic gangster iconography taken from Hollywood, and then goes with Mafia 2, the second chapter, into the historical representation of this Italian-American mafia. And through a comparative study of mafia historians, modern historians, and cultural historians of the mafia, it is possible to identify an historical depiction made up of stereotypes, but also precautions. And a real change, of course, is represented by Mafia 3, which puts the Italian-American mafia in the background to deal with still current issues such as racism and gender issues. And in Mafia 3, we have an almost direct interaction with the past through the typical interaction of the video games. It's what I said during the presentation that you can find on YouTube. And at the end, the analysis of the Mafia trilogy shows a maturation, including context of the video games, also in relation to the context of development and the release. And this is what's important to find the message behind the historical representation in video games and to understand how this is expressed, because it also concerns current society. So at the end, from a cultural point of view, we can find with the analysis of the video game series Mafia, the predominance of a typical American vision. I call American soft power from the definition of Joseph Nye, that is very popular in media representation, not only video games, but we are talking about video games. So.
Thank you very much, Lorena. Let me see. I think somebody's already got a question, probably. Is that? So I can't quite follow the chat. So I'm asking if somebody has a question to please.
I can see Francesco question here.
Yeah.
Posso?
Sì.
Yes, please.
Lorena, faccio una domanda in italiano, magari Marco può tradurla se vuole tradurla, o se no anche direttamente in inglese, insomma, come preferisci.
Not a problem if I can translate for you if you prefer, so no worries.
Ok. Tra le conclusioni dell'intervento che hai fatto, parli di una certa predominanza del soft power americano nella serie Mafia. Se potevi parlarcene un po' di più, diciamo.
Sì, of course I prefer answer in Italian, but
I'll just quickly translate it so that the others can understand. So, towards the conclusions of your interventions, you mentioned the predominance of an American soft power in representing Mafia, and I wondered, Francesco asked whether you could elaborate on that. Thank you.
Okay. Marco, tell me, I don't know, I prefer answering in Italian, but I can try to answer in English.
No worries, I can translate if you prefer so.
Ok, thank you. Allora, la definizione di soft power appunto è presa da Joseph Nye per intendere l'abilità attrattiva di un paese tramite i valori culturali e politici. E questa cosa noi la ritroviamo all'interno dei videogiochi basati soprattutto sul contesto storico. L'abbiamo visto prima parlando anche con Stefano nel mondo fantasy, nel mondo futuristico, perché attualmente le più recenti produzioni, ad esempio, sono molto legate all'immaginario western e della frontiera americana. Nel caso di Mafia, però, per arrivare dritti al punto, è interessante vedere come il primo Mafia, che tra l'altro è stato sviluppato da un team di sviluppo di 5 persone, in Repubblica Ceca, abbia preso l'immaginario gangster tipico di Hollywood, in particolar modo poi dei film di Francis Ford Coppola e Brian De Palma, per poi creare una sua mafia storia all'interno del videogioco, ed è ciò che l'ha reso poi un cult nell'industria videoludica. Ecco. Successivamente è interessante vedere come la serie più si addentra nella storia, più mette da parte la mafia italo-americana, che comunque è un prodotto in realtà tipicamente americano, e per l'appunto riprende sì i riferimenti storici. In Mafia 2 troviamo anche dei riferimenti reali a mafiosi realmente esistiti. Tutto questo però per mostrare poi un lato della cultura americana, perché per esempio in Mafia 2 abbiamo Vito Scaletta che non rappresenta in realtà il migrante italo-americano come viene presentato all'inizio, ma nella sua scalata tra i ranghi della malavita della città in cui è ambientata, Empire Bay, che è una sorta di New York, lui rappresenta il self-made man e il coronamento dell'American Way of Life. Tutto questo chiaramente in ottica criminale, ma di base appunto troviamo i valori americani, per ritornare al discorso del soft power. E infine questa esplosione del soft power la troviamo in Mafia 3, che veramente pone in secondo piano la mafia italo-americana, perché vuole parlare del razzismo. L'ambientazione infatti è 1968 ed è interessante vedere come per la prima volta nella serie il protagonista non è più un mafioso italo-americano, è un afroamericano veterano dalla guerra del Vietnam. E tutto il terzo capitolo è incentrato sulla sua vendetta per motivi personali contro la famiglia Marcano, sì, che è una famiglia mafiosa italo-americana, però il tema principale del gioco resta il razzismo. Ed è interessante vedere qui come il gioco utilizzi appunto per parlare della storia e dei tumulti tipici del 1968, non solo la storia, ma anche il gameplay e i personaggi secondari. E questa evoluzione, questo cambiamento della rappresentazione della mafia italo-americana non è altro che invece una sottolineatura, se così si può dire, in realtà dell'influenza della cultura americana anche in specifici temi come per l'appunto la criminalità organizzata di origine italiana in America.
Right, so I hope you will excuse me because I'm not a professional interpreter. So I hope that I was able to capture everything that Lorena said. So basically, the definition that Lorena proposed came from Joseph Nye, and it comes from a definition of soft power that, of course, is the extension of values that come from the political and historical circumstances of a particular nation. And so the historical context would play a really important role in the creation, not just of historical, but also of imaginative worlds. So if you look at the first Mafia game, you have gangsters from Hollywood movies, such as movies from Coppola or De Palma. So you've got this re-elaboration of a cult figure of the gangster within the game. But then as the series turns to the second episode, it becomes more historical based, and it drops the original themes partly, even though still incorporating real historical elements about real mafiosi, but it becomes more about historical events such as World War II. And in doing so, you get interesting things such as Vito Scaletta, who is basically a character that reflects the ideology and the values of the narrative of the self-made man in the United States, even though read through the lens of criminality. And then by the time you hit Mafia 3, that leaves behind the settings of the previous games and even the focus turns to the 1960s, and it's no longer, you no longer find an Italian-American playable character, the main character, but rather you find a black person, an Afro-descendant. And so the games even tackles racism openly, and that becomes the main theme. And so the game looks at the events from 1968 through both, you know, the perspective of the main character and non-playable characters. And that is attributed, it's probably can be attributed to the United States influence on the production of the game. Lorena, I'm not sure I'll translate everything.
No, thank you so much, Marco. Perfect.
So can the next question please be in English? I'm just kidding. Okay, so we do have other questions, sorry. I'm not sure which one is the first. Probably is from Thierry, and then Leila, and then Stefano, if I'm not wrong. Did I leave somebody behind? Can we have Thierry?
Mi sentite?
Thank you.
Sì.
Ok. No, vado anch'io in italiano se non è un problema. Allora, riguardo...
Sorry, please go on.
Riguardo i primi due capitoli di Mafia, appunto sappiamo che riguardo alla creazione dei personaggi, diciamo, per creare i personaggi, gli sviluppatori appunto sono basati molto sui film di De Palma, cioè, i classici film, diciamo, appunto di gangster americani, mentre invece Lincoln Clay è un po', diciamo, differente come personaggio. Volevo chiedere appunto a Lorena se, cioè, quali sono stati, ad esempio, cioè, gli sviluppatori, le opere magari che hanno influito per la creazione appunto di questo personaggio che è un po' più differente appunto rispetto a quelli dei primi due capitoli.
Ok, grazie Ture per questa domanda che in realtà è molto interessante e mi apre in realtà un'altra questione.
Should I translate that, Lorena, for the audience? The question is, so Lorena, you said that the first two chapters of the series focus on the gangster film mythology, and then that changes and it becomes different. So I wondered, the question says, what pieces of work, what elements influenced the production when it came to writing and producing the third game?
Sì, allora dicevo che in realtà la domanda è molto, molto interessante, che ci riapre al discorso che abbiamo toccato ieri su anche il volere degli sviluppatori, perché è facile reperire dichiarazione dei diversi team di sviluppo che sono diversi, perché il primo Mafia è sviluppato da Illusion Softworks nel 2002, che era un team di sviluppo appunto in Repubblica Ceca composto da 5 persone, come ho detto prima. Dopodiché è passato a 2K Czech, quindi è diventato un team di sviluppo grande proprio per le produzioni AAA, per poi passare con Mafia 3 al team di sviluppo Hangar 13, che è statunitense. Quindi anche questo è interessante. La domanda di Ture che è legata al nome dei protagonisti. Ecco, se noi ci concentriamo sui dettagli, perché gli sviluppatori chiaramente tengono conto, lavorano anche sui dettagli, già i nomi dei 3 protagonisti di Mafia ci permettono di capire perfettamente l'evoluzione rappresentativa che abbiamo all'interno della serie, perché partiamo dal primo, che è Thomas Tommiangelo, di cui non abbiamo molti dettagli sul background, ma già dal nome capiamo che è un italo-americano di seconda generazione. Ed è il capitolo, tra l'altro, più cinematografico, non vuole dire nulla di storico, capiamo che è il proibizionismo e quant'altro, ma insomma non riprende tutti gli stilemi tipici dei gangster movie hollywoodiani. Il secondo Mafia abbiamo Vito Scaletta, che già dalle sonorità fa capire il nome non solo italiano, ma appunto per chi è siciliano come me sa che rimanda subito all'isola, e infatti lui è un immigrato che da piccolo vive il disagio e la povertà in Sicilia e con la famiglia si trasferisce poi negli Stati Uniti, in questa fittizia New York. E infatti il tema, come dire, la declinazione etnica della criminalità organizzata che troviamo negli Stati Uniti viene molto approfondita in Mafia 2, da qui appunto il passaggio più alla rappresentazione storica. E infine nel terzo già Lincoln Clay chiarifica perfettamente che il tema è il razzismo, perché Lincoln è un riferimento ad Abraham Lincoln e per la proclamazione di emancipazione contro la schiavitù nel 1863, quindi appunto vi è questo riferimento. Clay è un riferimento a Cassius Clay, al celebre pugile, ed è interessante anche qui il fatto che loro abbiano utilizzato Clay e non Muhammad Ali, che poi lui cambiò il nome in quel modo perché era supporter della National of Islam, perché comunque l'epoca di mafia è quella subito successiva alla lotta per i diritti civili degli afroamericani. Quindi ecco, già dai nomi possiamo capire effettivamente l'essenza di ciascun capitolo di mafia.
Right, so the answer that Lorena provided is basically you can see the changes in these historical notions that have been deployed by looking at the names of the characters employed throughout the games, and you know, contextualizing them when it comes to understanding how the producers went to decide about what themes they wanted to be reflected through the characters. The first game was produced by Illusion Software, which was a Czech developer. And then that company was absorbed by 2K, which was a larger studio. And eventually they became Hunger 13, which is a United States large conglomerate, I think. Throughout this process, the names of the characters changed according to the change in sources and the change of the lens that we look at the mafia from. So the first game had a Thomas, which wasn't really sounding like something that a global maybe audience would immediately recognize, but then that changes to the second episode where you get Vito Scaletta, which is a really Sicilian sounding name. And Vito is a migrant from Sicily who comes to a fictive New York. And the ethnic identity during the second chapter, which is reflected in the choice of the name, becomes much deeper and more relevant. So that becomes a more relevant theme throughout this process. And by the time that the third episode arrives, then you have characters which reflect historical figures such as Abraham Lincoln and Cassius Clay, which the developers prefer over the name Muhammad Ali, because that has to do with a series of choices that have to do with how they looked at the civil rights movements for the end of slavery and what followed in the US. So the third chapter definitely draws influences from the history of racism in the US and the legacy of slavery and the impact of slavery in current sociological realities. So you can look at these changes from the sources, and they are also reflected in the names of the character. I'm not sure I grasped everything, Lorena.
Yeah. Thank you.
And I've realized that this question came from Ture, which is probably Salvatore, is that right? So I was pronouncing it in English or something.
Sì.
Grazie, Salvatore. So the next one will be Leila, and then we got Stefano, and then Matteo.
Yes, well, first of all, thank you for your insights, Lorena. They're very good, and I definitely empathize with every single Italian who feels stereotyped in a gangster America, being from the Middle East and Mediterranean. You only have to think what Middle Easterns are portrayed like in video games. You know, we are a object to shoot at. We're often portrayed as the terrorists in video games. But I want to say something, and I don't expect you to actually solve that riddle. It's such a broad question by itself. I think it's a conversation. But having a small little anecdote, having a conversation one time with 11-Bit Studios, the Polish studio behind This War of Mine, they said something very interesting that I still remember. They said that when America wants to make a game about war, they have to win it. When the Polish make a game about war, they have to survive it. And that's a good perspective. My question is, how much time, if the question is time, does it take to divorce a stereotype? If it's a matter of objection, how much objection does it take to divorce a stereotype? And in today's very fast pace, you know, like the world is changing very quickly. Technology is definitely participating. How long does it take, and what does it take to divorce a stereotype?
But honestly, I'm a little bit optimistic, and I have some hope about the indie development, about the destruction of stereotypes. I'm sorry for my English, so I hope I would be clear when I'm talking. Because about, for example, war representation, World War II representation, we have the American predominance in the World War II representation. But I can quote it, just for example, one game of indie development team that is Through the Darkest of Times. It is about the German resistance against Nazi. And it's something that I never seen in video games, I mean, in the last years. So I think that indie development team have more courage and maybe more possibilities than a AAA. Because when we talk about AAA, we think about Call of Duty, as I said, Assassin's Creed. They took a collective imaginary to a big audience to make feel confidence a big audience. So there is a problem about stereotypes, and I agree with you, but I'm optimistic about the indie development video games. I hope I answered to your question.
It's hardly a question answerable.
Yeah.
You know, just more like a conversation. But yes, definitely. Thank you.
Thank you. So the next question comes from Stefano Caselli.
Yes, thank you very much for your presentation. I can ask you my question in English for the joy of Marco, or otherwise I can make it in Italian. Just tell me if you prefer to.
I prefer Italian, but I know Marco prefers English, so don't worry.
Then I can ask this to Marco. Marco, can I?
No.
If you if it's needed, I will translate. No worries.
Yeah. Just make the question as you prefer, and then we'll see.
Okay, fine. I was wondering about Fire Emblem Three Houses, for example, but other historical games or games in general, of course. For example, that's a question that some students of mine raised about Red Dead Redemption 2, for example, and it's exactly that of how much digital games, in your opinion, are in a way making our memory of a certain period in the past or our historical representation of that period more violent than it really was. I mean, even if in Mafia games, for example, okay, they are inspired in a way by both Mafia movies or historical representation of that, or historical narratives of a certain period. But I mean, in Mafia movies, both for productive limitations or boundaries of the cinema, the medium of the cinema, we see, for example, Mafia men killing 10 people, maybe 20 people, maybe 30 people. I don't know how the kill count in Mafia movies, but in a Mafia game, for example, or in Western games with a Western setting, such as Red Dead Redemption 2, you can see the main character killing a lot more people. I mean, main characters in digital games, for ludological aspects or dynamics in the game, kill hundreds and hundreds of people. Do you think that this, for what concerns at least the Mafia man, the depiction of the Mafia man, is this affecting our representations, our broader way to conceive the Mafia man back then as a more violent man, as a more violent figure? And is our history in a way becoming more and more violent through digital games? Of course, it's a hard question. I just wanted to ask you for your opinion about this, and if you stepped into some sorts that could help me with this wonder. Thank you very much.
Thank you to you, Stefano. I think what you said concern every main character in video games, because also in Call of Duty or Battlefield, I mean, the Battlefield 1 is an exception maybe, but anyway, in video games setting during the World War II, especially World War II, we have the superhero that kill tons of enemy, maybe see his companies his companions die because of the enemy, just to make feel the player the hero. And I think that is connected with the interaction typical of video games, because I interact in the game through a character, and feeling a hero like my character is one of the typical aspects of video games. About the Mafia Man, this is true. For example, when I was playing the remake of the first Mafia Definitive Edition, I was surprised to see me in the as a Tommy Angelo, that in the game living the moral dilemma of being a mafioso, killing everyone in during his mission. So it's interesting, this contrast. I don't know if this representation can make more violent the memory of the past, but I don't know. It's a very hard question. I don't know, but for sure is you said the truth. It's a typical characteristic of video games, the killing tons of enemy to make feel the player as a hero. But as I said before, while I was answering to Leila, I'm optimistic, because video games are very experimental media. We have a different type of interaction. And for example, I really appreciated that in Mafia 3, where you can kill a tons of enemy with the Lincoln clay, and maybe it's more violent than Mafia 2 and Mafia the first chapter. But it's interesting because the killing are also in the background in Mafia 3, because as I said, the main theme is the racism, and you live the racism when you play Mafia 3, because you cannot enter in a segregationism store that are in the game, and if you do that, the storeman call the police and you have to shoot or escape. So maybe with the interaction and the other narrative themes in video games, this violence can be understood at least. I don't know. I hope I've answered your question.
Yeah, for sure. Thank you very much. We all hope for that.
Yeah.
Right. So thank you very much, Lorena Rao, for a talk and for engaging with the questions from the audience. We are running over, so I guess we're running over schedule. So I think that sort of wraps up the day. I would like to thank you all very much for joining us today. A lot of interesting conversations and others taking place in the chat, which we look forward to making available, as well as the recordings. I would like really to thank the speakers, Robert Houghton, Stefano Caselli, Lorena Rao, DIGRA Italia, particularly Paolo Ruffino, and the research group Ludus and Roma Tre. I hope that we have managed to build interesting connections around the many perspectives on and around video games and history. I don't know whether Paolo and Ludus have some final remarks before I interrupt the ongoing recording.
I just want to say thank you again to all. There were 2 amazing days for real, and I'm very happy and I'm very grateful to you all.
Yeah, I would just like to thank everyone, all the speakers, for their participation, the fantastic debates that we have had today and yesterday. The discussion was great. Thank you for everyone who participated at this event.
Right, so thanks everyone. What happens now is I'm going to interrupt the ongoing recording. And like we said, this will be uploaded online at a later point for the rest of the public. If you have any objections to your presence, please get in touch with us via the DIGRA Italian website. And by the way, I look forward to, I'm actually leaving the room open for everybody for a bit longer. So if you want to be connected a little bit longer with us and continue with with an informal chit chat, you're very welcome to do so. Please take care in these challenging times, and we look forward to being in touch with you in the future. Ciao.
Ciao.
Thank you.
Bye, thank you.
Bye. Ciao, ciao.